So one of the things that I wanted to just start out saying is, if you haven't seen the poll that I added this morning on Modern Quilt Studio Patterns and Fabrics, please answer your preferences for future quiltalongs, stash-friendly, color-focused, mystery, non-mystery, short, long. That's very helpful. So far we've had about, right before we logged on, I checked and we had like 437 people who
And that's just
answered.
after a couple hours. So your feedback is really helpful because we have lots of ideas. We have lots of things we want to do, and we try to fit them into your lives, your schedules, and your interests.
But you know, we were really thinking that because Sweet Tooth was so intense, that people would want a shorter, easier event, like a one-day sort of thing. But most people, it looks like 30% of people commented that they wanted multi-week non-mystery events. So
we'll think about that all. And that doesn't mean that we won't do shorter events as well.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
not one or the other. It's trying to find a balance of what works for you all, what works for us, and what you can learn from.
So we just want to make sure people are here, because it looks like there are people, but there's no comments yet. So if you could just like pop in to say hello, that would reassure
It's always
us.
reassuring to know
Yeah,
people are there.
Exactly, before we get going. So one of the things that we wanted to start with was a recap of Sweet Tooth.
And we know that some of the viewers participated in the Sweet Tooth Modern Mystery Quilt-Along. Some didn't, so this may be
Oh, there we go.
Okay, now
there's a ton of
we
people.
just
Okay,
got
good.
all our comments,
Thank
so we
you.
know you're there.
Good.
So good morning or good afternoon or whatever it is where you are. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we did in Sweet Tooth and then move on to some other things.
So one of the questions that we covered it a little bit in the 6th installment about thread color, but there have been a lot of very reasonable questions about thread colors for those of you who are using darker backgrounds.
And so to start with, let's just show you once again a detail of our folded Sweet Tooth quilt. So we chose to use the transparency watercolor fabrics on top of a light background. Now the light background was part of that line. A lot of people used a solid or used other light backgrounds. So when we quilted this, we opted for a light thread that really matched this background.
This is what we used, right?
Yeah, that's what we used.
This is the
parchment.
signature parchment text. This is a text 40, but I think they also have text 50, right?
I
don't know if they have it in that color, but this is what we used.
And it's 100% cotton.
But look, you cannot see. Do you see this? Like on this,
even when I get up close,
you can't see it.
And
I think thread color really fakes people out a lot.
And I think, and what we're going to get to is talking about how you deal with thread color if your background isn't light like ours was.
But can you get really close with that blue? Do you see how close you have to get to even be able to see the thread? So I know if you're new to us, you might not know that we generally don't recommend, actually, we never recommend variegated thread, because as much as you think it's going to match perfectly when you look at it on the spool, you can't control where the color lands, and sometimes it can look a little blotchy.
Yeah.
So we would not recommend variegated thread, but even look how, this is like cream thread, but you can't see it. So don't get psyched out about whether the color is going to be too strong on your quilt.
Quilters are generally advised that when you're trying to pick a thread color, that you don't look at the whole cone, but, oops, I've got kind of tangled here, but that you take a single strand, because in your finished quilt, it's a single strand, However, we go a little beyond that and say a single strand is, I'm going to put this right on top of the blue, and you can barely see it, but you can see it more when it's on top of the quilt, whoops, let me see there, than when it's quilted, because when it gets quilted, it gets in that furrow and it gets a little shadow because batting has thickness. And as it goes in that valley, it's always going to have a slight shadow. So regardless of what thread color you pick, it's always going to appear slightly less bright, less light in the finished quilt.
So just as a general rule to keep in mind, and I don't use that term rule, but it's basically guidance to keep in mind, is I like to take the lightest and the darkest fabrics in the quilt and find the middle point in terms of value, which is the lightness or darkness of the quilt, and then go a little on the lighter side.
And
just
this
in
is
general.
This is when dealing with an all-over quilting pattern. You know, it's different if you're switching thread colors. You might be trying to match specific colors, but with an all-over pattern that has to go across blue, red, there's tan in here, there's cream,
Purple, lavender.
then that's when we try to split the difference. And we want to talk about how you split that difference if the background is a lot darker than the other fabrics. So we have some quilts to show you.
So how about look at,
That's a good one.
which one?
Tube socks.
Yeah, tube socks, that's a good one. So this is the same concept for sweet tooth, for those of you using a darker background.
And I'm going to get really close so you can just see. And I know that on video, this background color is probably going to appear a little darker than it really is, but
it's a teal and black mini gingham.
I mean, it's so mini that you really have to get close to see that it's a woven gingham. All of the fabrics in this quilt, and I'm going to open it up because some of you won't have seen this. This is a quilt called Tube Socks.
It's in our Warp and Weft
which
publication.
I can grab, it's right there. And the reason we want to show this is look how we have the very light yellow tube sock, and then we have the very dark kind of mallard background color. And the thread color we chose for this, you know,
Is this it?
Yes, I believe it is.
I think it's gray.
Okay,
It's more gray.
It's
this
about that
value a little bit
value.
more gray.
And you know, it's actually hard to tell what the thread color is because in some places it looks gray, in some places it looks camel colored, and that kind of proves the point that it's a chameleon. When it's on the light yellow, yeah, you see it's a little darker than yellow, and when it's on the dark background, it's a little lighter. But as soon as you back up just 2 feet, you barely see the color of the thread. Instead, you see the texture and the flow of the design.
I always think in terms of the way the thread feels in the final quilt, that I would always rather see, if you have to choose between dark and light, I would always rather see a lighter thread on a darker background than a darker thread on a lighter background, because that threads, they look black very quickly, and it feels then heavy on the lighter fabrics.
And I also think it's kind of psychological. If a thread looks like a line, it kind of looks like someone drew on the quilt, and we have associations with line being a black pen or a dark pencil.
Yeah.
And when a line is lighter, it doesn't feel as heavy, and it kind of integrates into the overall design and color, I think, more successessed. Now, these are always guidelines. There are certain quilts that you might feel differently about.
Well, in Sweet Tooth, we went with this, we matched the thread to the background fabric.
Yeah.
This meringue that we're sold out of, because we knew that even on the absolute darkest, can you show that one up close? Even on the darkest fabric in the quilt, it just doesn't look that light. It doesn't look that obvious.
And when we did our secret agent Quiltalong, this was also an issue that came up because the secret agent had some nearly black prints, and it also had some really yellow.
Black.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
if we've got it right there.
Okay. And then, and it had that yellow.
Yeah, and so it basically had, I'm going to open this up, the dark charcoal, and look how up close you really see the light line of our quilting. And you back up.
And we're talking about like 3 feet away at this point.
Suddenly everything disappears. And when you see the entire quilt, this is another issue. The piecing is so strong and the structure of the quilt is so strong that that's what you see first. The quilting, the thread color is a secondary layer of design that you discover up close but not far away.
So, and you are obviously, it's always an option to change thread colors if, and we've done that on occasion as well, but we're trying to, I guess, get you more comfortable and get you a little bit more relaxed about thread colors so you don't worry about choosing the wrong color or that kind of thing.
And, not all of our quilts, but the majority of our quilts, we do like all over quilting patterns. There are people who love what's often called heirloom quilting, or where every block is a little different.
Heirloom quilting.
No, some people.
Yeah, I think it's just expensive.
Custom quilting too, where each block or each section of the quilt is quilted differently, and that's a beautiful art form. It's, we happen to concentrate more on the piecing and the forms of the color work. And so for us, very often the quilting supports those design intentions. Whereas for some people, the quilting is the primary fun for them. It's what they love.
Although I think there are some areas where the quilting, we have had elaborate quilting, but it's in a kind of an open negative space, a large amount of negative space.
Where it's not competing. It's,
right.
Even though we have intricate fill, it acts as an all-over texture within the space, and it's not the giant feather or the giant flower that becomes a focal point. It is a beautiful detail up close within a larger area.
So the other thing, we touched on this a little bit in the last installment of Sweet Tooth as well, is we tend to think about the scale of the quilting motif in relation to the scale of the pieces. So since we've got, you want to talk about that since we just got Secret Agent out?
Since I've got Secret Agent out, I need to get this here. Do you see those little orange strips?
Like this?
They're really small, and even that yellow band is fairly narrow. So we wanted to make sure that our quilting was denser than any of the smallest pieces. That way, if our quilting was 2 inches apart, it would create rivers or gaps that would have shadow that would actually almost look like pieces of the quilt. Mm-hmm. When we go this densely, it makes it a flatter texture. Now it's not so dense, and if you look at this, it still drapes beautifully.
Yeah,
it's
actually,
soft.
Let's hold it. Yeah,
okay.
This is when we talk about drape. This is the way we like our quilts to drape. Mm-hmm. So it's gonna hug the body really nicely. Even if this is a wall hanging, obviously you can make different choices because it's a wall hanging. But in general, we like a soft drape.
We like a soft drape. If something is quilted so densely that it becomes stiff, it's not as comforting. And also, if it's overly densely quilted, sometimes you actually feel the stitching.
But if it's a wall hanging, that's appropriate.
It can be fantastic.
Yeah.
So, do you want to look at okay, I'll follow your lead.
Yes, because
yeah.
Okay, batting for drape. So, Modern Quilts Illustrated 15 had I
can get it.
Okay.
Yeah. You can talk. Over. I'll climb over.
Had a batting section on it where we tested 6 battings And for drape, for cost, for warmth, for washability. And there's a big spread in here on how it's not a one size fits all sort of approach. So this is in Modern Quilts Illustrated 16. Most of our quilts are made, we use like Secret Agent. That is Request, the Quilter's Dream, 100% cotton Request. And
Request is a name they use for their lightest weight.
Their lightest loft. So, but the drape, I always feel like I need to give a caveat here. There's a lot of factors that go into the drape. The first one is pre-washing to shrink everything down.
Meaning the fabric, not the batting.
Not the batting. So this is about a 1/4 inch to distance between lines of stitching. So
this is the tightest we go.
Yeah, this is the tightest we would go. But it's still with this batting or with a bamboo, that would also give a great drape. So then it's the combination of pre-washing that 100% cotton thin batting, which is the Request. Then we wash it and dry it on low, and then we get it out of the washer or dryer and we steam press it. So
not harshly.
No, but you want to kind of get it flat again. And that is, to me, I think of it as kind of a modern day version of blocking.
Yeah, it kind of relaxes it a bit.
Because you can see it still looks consistent and neat and square. It doesn't look rumpled, but when you look up close, it's still got a ton of texture and it has a really nice drape. So it's a combination. We always joke that when we used to do live teaching, there were 3 questions that we always had to answer before we could leave the room. And then the first one was, what is the batting you're using? But it was never really the question. It was how I want that drape. I want that little crinkly texture.
Yeah, and that came about.
It's a combination of a bunch of things.
Well, I think that question was always asked because we would pass our quilts around in the audience and people were feeling them. So they immediately jumped to the conclusion that the feel was only about the batting, whereas it's the batting, the washing, the density of the stitching, and the washing and drying afterwards. So this density of quilting that you see here works really, really well with the lightweight batting. If we went with a higher loft batting, it probably would not work very well because there would be such severe kind of mountains and it would poof up.
I don't think it would be that.
I think you'd want it to be about 50% larger distance between the... Personally,
we may disagree. I think for me, whether it has polyester in it is a bigger... That is a stiffer, slightly stiffer quilt, but it's a stiffer quilt for sure.
Yeah, and so one of the things we encourage people to do is a little sample. Quilt, like if you know, like we do, that you're going to wash and dry your quilt afterwards and you're trying a new pattern, you might just do a little square foot of it and see what it looks like, not right when you're done, but after you've washed and dried it. If you're going to wash and dry it. There are lots of reasons to do that, not just for the look, but also if it's a bed quilt to determine how much it's going to shrink. We talk about this a lot, but a queen size quilt made with all cotton batting often shrinks 6 to 8 inches in each direction.
2 to 5%, right? That's the...
Well, the batting shrinks 2 to 5%, but the quilting can add an additional 2 to 3%. So it just... You don't know until you put all those factors together, the density of the quilting and the batting.
So if you want to do this thin quilting, either my recommendation would be to either use a softer batting like this 100% cotton Request. And this is where we say we have no gig with Quilter's Dream. We buy our batting the same way everybody else does. And so we're just sharing. I just feel I want to be super transparent with this.
We're not cashing in on this.
No, we're not. We're not ambassadors or anything. either the request, if you like this drape and you want to do dense quilting, either the request drape or their bamboo is also it has a soft drape like this. If I don't think it looks as good if you're quilting, an inch and a half apart or an inch apart, your lines of stitching. That's when I think having a little bit heavier loft or having a blend might be better, because otherwise it can get a little
It can get a little saggy
there's
and wrinkly.
wrinkly and crinkly, and they're different.
Yeah. The good texture and the bad texture.
Exactly. Bad texture. It's
Yeah.
not what we're looking for.
Right.
So, do you want to talk about this?
Sure. This is a quilt, and I'm going to back up. Can you find the overall photo? This is a quilt from long, long ago, and we're looking at an edge that has this kind of piano key, fringe-like edge. This is a quilt called Best of Both Worlds. And
here it's in Modern Quilts Illustrated 2.
So there are a couple things we'd like to talk about with Best of Both Worlds. First is this has a great example of high contrast between light and dark in the piecing. So I'm going to pull this up and go up close.
These are Joe Morton and David Butler back when he was, this is about 10 years old, this quilt.
And one thimbleberries, for those of you who remember thimbleberries. But if you look at that kind of icy blue fabric, it's the lightest one.
Oh, it's on your side.
Oh, there we go. Is
that one?
Okay.
Yep.
That's the lightest fabric. And then the background, which appears black on screen, is actually a deep, deep, deep blue black. And I'm going to move in so you can see the thread color.
And we just did a simple stipple on this because there was a lot going on.
So this, I believe, is kind of a medium gray. And what you'll see is
I'd call it a light gray, by the way.
As you get up close, you really do see it on that near black. But as you back up, it completely disappears.
And you can't believe, because it's like, it's kind of like this value in gray. It's really not very dark at all.
It does disappear. The other thing is, if you look, the quilting is further apart by far than that secret agent. We probably have 3 to 5/8 of an inch between, in areas that aren't quilted. Just there, it depends on the area.
Okay.
But it's much looser than that secret agent.
Same batting.
Same batting. It also has kind of a lovely drape to it. On the back, we use kind of a green black. Maybe you can see the quilting better. I can't see the camera.
It's good. You can see it.
But we wanted to show this quilt for 2 reasons. It really does show how you deal with a dark background fabric and how a lighter I pulled out the scissors earlier because I saw a little piece I had to trim. But with dark backgrounds and light fabrics, you can often go lighter than you think you can.
Way lighter than you think.
And again, I'm going to say it over and over, the thread ends up in a valley, it ends up in shadow. So, look at this. We are 10 years later, we're still trimming threads off our quilts. But we have this for 2 reasons. And one is to talk about the quilting. The other is someone in the group asked if we could talk about some certain stories about how we name quilts and how that kind of affects our design.
You're jumping all over the place, though.
I know, but we have the quilt out. Do you want to get that now?
No, I.
Okay, she keeps me on track.
We'll come back to the names.
Okay, we'll come back to it.
We have important things to discuss before we go into the names.
Tag, you're it.
Yeah, I've got the outline, which
I just ignore.
He always ignores.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other thing that we want to talk about with Sweet Tooth is that the design is such, for those of you who made it, can you hold it that way? Thank you. Yes. Just as a reminder, this line block here has a little spacer below it. So you can't assemble it all the way across in one fell swoop. You need to look at whatever your layout is and assemble the left side, the center, and the right side separately depending on where that line block hits in your layout. So I saw some people saying that they were going to assemble it by rows, and just beware that you can't go all the way across.
It's a partial row,
Yeah.
and that's indicated in the assembly diagram.
Yeah, just
And
follow the assembly diagram and read that section.
And just make sure you have that thinking in your mind that that lime column has to be pieced as one column, and it can be attached no matter what order it's in.
Exactly.
It gets attached to the other pieces. So it's definitely
I think it's a lot easier to manage to have just to be able to assemble a wider section rather than the long rows that sometimes can stretch.
long rows,
Yeah.
long columns
They
can
stretch.
bow or distort. You know, whenever we're in someone else's sewing space, we can see their setup, and very often, you know, we all very often are trying to make the best use of space that we can, but we may not have an ideal space. So sometimes you're in a little corner, sometimes it's just the way your sewing table is. And I've often seen people tend to piece in a way that's not quite symmetrical. It introduces a little bowing
I think
to
it's
their long
more.
columns.
I think it's just more when something is long and narrow, the weight of it stretches.
Pulls, yeah.
It just distorts the rows. So if you're just doing 3 at a time, and then you have a section that's 3 rows by 7 rows, that's not going to distort
Yeah.
it all. Whereas if you have a whole bunch of 7 or 8 block long rows, as you're pinning them, they can often get distorted.
Assembling a top in chunks rather than long rows or columns tends to give more stability and less distortion.
Okay, so I think that covers Sweet Tooth for now.
And except for one last
Yes.
thing. Please, we love seeing all your
it's so
experimentation with
fantastic.
layouts. It is, as we explained in the Quiltalong, we provided a handful of options, but there are literally hundreds of layouts. And so when you post what you're looking at, it's great for everyone because we're all learning about possibilities, what works for you, what works for someone else. New ideas, keep it coming.
It looks great. And then you'll be opening the submissions for the exhibition.
On April 30th. So with all of our Quiltalongs, about a month after the Quiltalong ends, we open up submissions where you can post photos you've taken on your phone. We create a gallery, and shortly after the submissions open, we will announce on social media when the exhibition itself is open.
And where will they find that link to submit their...
The Bakehouse. Those of you who are already involved in the Quiltalong know that there's this secret portal called the Bakehouse. If you scroll down to the bottom of that page, there will be a section on the exhibition with a link to the submissions starting April 30th. There's not a link now. There's an explanation of it. The link will be live at the end of the month.
So then there was another question about using the Sweet Tooth bundle for the local colored dye that Bill designed many years for AccuQuilt. That is sold out, but there's you can still find it.
I don't have a picture of it for
resale.
those of you who don't have it. I'm sorry.
But anyway, can you...
So the local color dye was basically overlapping circles, kind of half circles that overlap.
But it was a hue-based transparency.
Yeah, it was a transparency quilt intended to be hue-based, but it could also be value-based. And if you have the Sweet Tooth bundle, if you happen to already have done the Sweet Tooth Quiltalong, in that very first installment, we had an entire page of, I think we had 27 possible transparencies. Any of those combinations would work beautifully for the local color dye. If you didn't take part in that, you want to just think about take yourself back to school when you mix paints for the first time, how yellow and blue mix to make green, or yellow and red make orange. This whole, we've got the line behind us. The line was developed to allow for many of those transparencies. So for local color, you can basically just say X overlapped with Y gives you Z. And any of those combinations should work really nicely with local color.
I think you can also look at some of the beautiful quilts on the Modern Quilt Studio Patterns and Fabrics page, because you'll see the overlaps that people have created. And
yeah, even if you go back to that first installment when people were posting their recipe or the recipe boxes.
Oh, the recipe boxes.
Those recipe boxes are all combinations of two that overlap to create a third. That's entirely how the local color quilt works.
Okay, so switching gears, this morning, Bill and I, we work far ahead in terms of quiltalongs, but we have been trying to, I guess, rethink other options for quiltalongs moving forward, in part because of tariffs and things, that quilting fabric is going to get more expensive in some cases. But also we know that even if fabric doesn't get more expensive, other things might be getting more expensive. So having the ability to use your stash might be more and more attractive to people.
But also
at least in part.
Yeah, we like to design quilts. Periodically there'll be a quilt like Sweet Tooth, which is geared towards this line that allows you to do transparency with the option of working from your stash. But we also like quiltalongs where...
Like Hive,
yeah. Where you could work from your stash, you could supplement it with a current line we have, that it works for different people's aesthetics and budgets. So
we were thinking, because Sweet Tooth was so intense in terms of precision, and it was 6 weeks, so it was a long time. We were thinking that people were going to want a smaller, kind of easier quiltalongs. And we were really surprised when I put up the poll this morning, and there were, at least right before we got on, there were 437 people or something who had responded saying that they wanted, the number one by a long shot answer was stash-friendly, multi-week, non-mystery quilt. Quiltalong. And that's a little different than we were expecting you to say, but which is helpful.
It's helpful. It doesn't mean that we won't do an occasional short quiltalong, because, for instance, with the Hive quiltalong that some of you participated in, it was basically like, here it is, and here's some tips for it. And boy, you made beautiful quilts. I mean, we're still seeing every week people completing that quilt, and I think it was very successful. And we know for some people that kind of one day quiltalong really fits into your lifestyle, your available time. So we'll still be doing things like that, but the idea of possibly introducing a multi-week quiltalong that's not a mystery quilt is something that we're kind of wrapping our heads around right now.
I think one of the challenges of that is that there are so many of you have told us, if I had seen that quilt, I never would have signed up because it had curves or it looked too complicated. And so one of the reasons
I would have been kind of psyched out.
I would have been psyched out.
Not because you didn't like what it looked like, but people would sometimes say,
it's going to be too much work or something.
Or it would be beyond my current skill set or color abilities. And after completing it, they're like, yeah, I get it now. You walked us through that.
No, but there are lots of people who say, I can't believe I made
that quilt.
Secret Agent or whatever.
Or Sweet Tooth.
Yes. And so this is where we're trying to double check those poll results
Yeah.
and saying like, are you sure? And I'd appreciate, in the comment section, like if we design a multi-week quilt along with a curve in it or 5 curves in it, and we commit to teaching you how to do it, are you going to look at the curve and say like, oh, I'm not doing curves. I'm not doing templates, And so that's kind of the challenge for us, is that we're worried that if we show you a quilt that we know that that is kind of a similar level of complexity that we've had to our other quilt-alongs, will you look at it and say like, oh, there's no way I could do that?
Yeah.
So that's
balancing act. Whatever we do, none of these changes are permanent.
Yeah.
We love the narrative aspect of the mysteries. We can go back to this isn't a permanent shift. It's just like we're always trying new things and trying to meet you where you are.
And we're also trying to, I think in the world right now, there's a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen next. And there's risk tolerance. I kind of feel like I'm concerned that people might not have the risk tolerance that they had a year ago for spending, $100 or whatever on $150 on fabric and a quilt along, and they investing that time, whether they might be a little bit more like, I'd like to know what I'm getting into before I sign up for this thing and commit to buying the fabric. Oh, Brenda says she wants curves. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see if anybody else joins you.
And this is always one of the hard things because they're the vocal, I love curves, and the vocal, never a curve. And
Kay wanting mysteries.
Yeah.
know.
So different quilt-alongs, different events for different people. But, if I had my way, I'd have a curve all the time. I love curves. But the making it accessible matters. As Week said, in a time where there's a lot of uncertainty, some people love the escape of intricacy and detail. Others want to have a little lighter.
I'm having a little distraction here that I need to.
Week's having a distraction.
We have.
Out with it.
For those of you who missed it, right after the day after the March Quilts First, our dog died. You might have heard him coughing. Beloved. He had pneumonia, and we've been fostering another dog for the last month who joined our family last weekend. Come here, Lucky. Come here. And she's been wanting to say hello.
So we've been fostering Lucky, who is staying.
So this is Lucky. She's a permanent part of our family now. She's a 1-year-old Bichon mix, we think, rescued from Paws Chicago and Animal Control in Chicago. And she's a sweetie. So she just wanted to say hello.
Yeah, she's
yes, there you go.
She's actually very well behaved right now. And so she may make an appearance every now and then as we try to.
Yes, you may hear barking.
She's learning how to be a live streamer. Yes,
exactly. Okay, so lots of people saying they're not afraid of curves. That's really helpful to hear. So maybe maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to participate.
Yes,
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
sorry. I'm distracted.
Yes.
Thank you for your comments.
Yes.
And there we go.
Yes.
Now the problem is she's going to want to be up here all the time, and I think she wants to play.
I know she does want to play because she's a little dog.
She's a teenager, not even a teenager.
Yes, well, she's kind of a teenager. Yes.
So, the poll information is helpful. We're going to think about it. We won't make Lucky have the final say on all this.
She would just be anything chewable.
Anything chewable,
squeaky,
yes.
Squeaky toys. Chewable. Put a squeaky toy in it.
And chicken flavored. So we will be letting you know what's coming up soon for this summer because we have to finalize our plans. We actually have a lot of fun things designed. It's a matter of figuring out the structure
and the sequence because we may have a variety of multi-week or ones with solids, ones with prints, one stash, and that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
but stash will definitely play
Yes,
into
absolutely.
it because we have a lot of stash to use too.
The one thing I would also love to hear your thoughts on is we've been thinking because, and for those of you who are retired, it might not be as much of an issue, but for us, us working stiffs, weekends are really precious. And what we are trying to figure out is whether, and also people who, can't be available at noon when something releases, we're thinking about having releases and or live streams on weekday evenings. So people who are working or who are traveling on the weekends during the summer could have access to their installments.
And everything
or
will, everything will always be recorded. So if you can't
Yeah.
make it live,
Yeah.
And I am going to make a request for a toy for Lucky because Lucky, she got Lucky riled up, and Lucky's over here wanting to play. So
Yes, there's lots of toys.
yeah,
She had a
we
bully
miss
stick.
our old dog Kip
Yes.
dearly, and Lucky is
We were not thinking we were going to get a dog so soon, but the
Lucky came along.
Yes, Lucky came along. So there.
Merci Frédéric. I'm reading. It's so nice to have the French going along in the chat.
Then, okay, so the other question, so we're going to be thinking about all of the, but if you haven't responded in the poll, please do, because it does help us make decisions with the one caveat that we know sometimes, last time we did a poll, we asked how many of you wanted to use your stash and versus having a palette kind of pre-assembled, and 80% of the people said they wanted to use their stash, and we said okay. And so then the next two Quiltalongs, we ended up running out of bundles because we were basing our expectations on.
Sorry. You
Yes,
started something by bringing her up.
So that is always the challenge, because we know that sometimes when you you answer a poll question not having seen a specific situation, and I think in the case of the other Quiltalongs, we sold out because people said, I don't have that in my stash and I really like that, or I want to use solids for the first time and I don't have any solids. So there's, you kind of gotta, we're not taking it too literally.
Right.
It's
Basically, whenever there's going to be a stash event, we'll probably have a fabric option for people who don't have those fabrics or want a little more guidance. We'll work with all of that.
Yeah. And I'm glad that at least Claire likes the idea of some weekday evenings.
Great.
Then there was a request that we talk about inspiration for some of our quilts, actually, before we leave the poll thing, the one thing that came up on the poll that I can conclusively say we will not do. I'm enjoying imagining what Lucky's doing on the ground. She's going back and forth. She's got a chew toy. She's got all kinds of squeaky
need to grab
toys.
one of those.
Yes, she's a busy girl. She's a teenager.
She's
actually
generally
and if
very
we
well
had crated her, she would be barking up a storm. So anyway, on the poll, somebody added design along, and I will say we used to do a week-long workshop that it was like all day, every day for a week, called Idea to Quilt. And we also did it for guilds. There were maximum 20 people we could get to. So the idea of doing a design along with 1,000 people makes our heads explode.
Even 40 people.
Even 40 people. Even 30 people. Yeah.
I think teaching design or original quilt design it's actually hard to do over 12 or 14 people.
Right.
Even that is hard. So we love doing it, but it's just not really feasible. So,
Yeah, that requires truly one-on-one conversations and one-on-one decisions, and it's designing these. We're not using traditional motifs that we're just scaling up or down or rearranging. We're starting from scratch every time. So that's the one thing we definitely cannot do.
Sorry, Lucky.
So, okay, but there were questions about, could we talk about...
Sorry, Lucky?
Yeah, you got to ignore her. She's got to learn. You've got to also focus. Okay, so there were some questions about, can you talk about the inspiration for Quiltalong themes and some quilt names? And can you give some examples?
I'm going to start with a non-Quiltalong. And I want to once again show this, which was called Best of Both Worlds, because I think it talks about how we approach design. This was a decade ago, and we noticed that when we went into quilt shops, first of all, quilt shops tended to have a design style. There would be a quilt shop that would have...
This still is the case.
Yeah. Sometimes you have one quilt shop in town that's known as the reproduction or the feed sack shop, or one that specializes in batiks, or there's the modern shop. And every now and then you have a quilt shop where the owner has 2 or 3 very different genres, but you'll have the reproduction fabrics in one corner of the shop, and then you'll have the modern fabrics in another. And there's a real physical separation within the shop. This was an example where from a distance, there are some that are larger scale and some are smaller, but when you get up close, you realize that some of these are drawn from 100-year-old designs and some are totally modern, but they share a color palette and they share kind of a monochromatic, desaturated look. And the reason it's called Best of Both Worlds is half the fabrics are very modern and half are very traditional. And yet, due to their color, due to the line work that you might see in them, the modern and traditional ones actually work really, really well together. I'm not pointing out here which is which. If I actually go to the piano keys, you can see a lot of the fabrics at once. But the Best of Both Worlds was a way of saying this quilt celebrates it tries to overcome a divide that happens in the quilting world from the very get-go, from the fact that there are designers who have specialization, then the people who market the fabric and the fabric companies. There are these divisions that filter down to how it's presented to you, the quilter, in a shop or even on a website. If you shop online, things are often filtered by genre or by designer. And by calling it Best of Both Worlds, we were saying it doesn't have to be one or the other. These can work really well together.
Okay, so I'm going to also add a little bit more context to this, which is I designed this quilt and specifically wanted it to combine Joe Morton fabrics and David Butler fabrics after I taught at QuiltCon for the first time, because over and over and over in every class, I heard people bad-mouthing traditional fabrics.
Yep.
And it really bothered me. And it became it was bordering on kind of mean girl behavior.
Yeah.
And I really didn't like it. I didn't like it from a personal perspective, but I also didn't like it from a design perspective, because I didn't want... That's not what modern quilting was to me, and I thought that there was some they were misunderstanding. The idea of modern quilting is that you can use any fabrics in any way, and it's kind of, was it Duke Ellington? There's good music and bad music, and that fabric is a tool that you use for design, and it doesn't matter what the genre is. that's to me part of modern quilting that I thought a lot of people were missing. So I came back from QuiltCon and I thought I'm going to take kind of the high priestess of traditional fabric design, which I think in many cases, you could argue is Joe Morton, and somebody like David Butler, who is doing really different types of fabric at the time, and put them side by side so you could see. This is David's, that you can see is the larger in scale, and this is David's too, next to Joe's, but they look fantastic because you're blending scales, and that's part of the modernity of the quilt to me.
But David also incorporated some that were a mixture of small and medium
Japanese
scale.
sort of influenced motifs.
So the other thing that we wanted, we kind of did here, is you look that all of these fabrics share line work. Sometimes they're thin lines, sometimes they're thick lines.
And they're most of them are tone on tone. They're not like 5 colors in it,
And so this is a great way of Weeks saying like, hey, don't badmouth this stuff.
Yeah, don't badmouth it.
It's good color, it's good line, it's good
beautifully
print.
designed fabric.
It's really, really good, and it plays well with other things. And so,
and also it's also part of our all quilters welcome kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like when I hear someone badmouth batiks or badmouth traditional, like, what?
Yeah.
Like, good fabric is good fabric.
Right.
Every fabric may have a
and
slight
good designers
challenge.
are good designers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can use Joe Morton fabrics in a variety of contexts that are modern and beautiful.
And you can use them in contexts that are traditional and beautiful.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be one or the other.
So that was part of the that was a defiance.
It was. Well,
defiance move on my part.
Or educational, depending on how you look at it. So with quilt names, sometimes they come to us early on. Sometimes they are kind of revealed as we work on them. And if
actually, do you want to talk about Secret Agent though?
Oh, okay. So Secret Agent. Oh, we've got so much here.
And this is the
going back to Secret Agent.
This is
Unfold.
The idea of Secret Agent came to us because we felt that this was going to be an election year starting in. We knew people were going to be stressed out, and we thought people need an escape, for this was 2024, and we need to kind of provide an all immersive 6-week-long escape that is beyond American culture. I think that and
going
kind
for
of
some universal themes.
The sort of James Bond culture.
A little suspense and intrigue.
Exactly. That extends beyond just the United States. So
and that idea of Secret Agent also was to capture the structure of the Quiltalong, in which participants were sewing units having absolutely no idea where they were going or when something was finished or when it was going to be transformed. And although that's common to a lot of our Quiltalongs, I think it was a little more intense with Secret Agent that it
was so silly. We went so crazy with the whole immersive part of it. But
so having a name.
Sometimes the name starts it.
And we actually had the Secret Agent name early on.
Before we had the layout of the quilt, and that informed it. The concept.
It even informed the color, kind of that dark mystery.
Sweet Tooth too.
Yeah, so Sweet Tooth.
Yeah.
We knew we wanted these kind of happy pastry, cake decoration colors.
We designed transparency watercolors, 18 months ago, I want to say. And so, transparency had sold really well. And, there was a discussion of, do you want to do a variation of that line to be able to do hue-based transparencies? That was kind of the conversation. And so then we designed, we knew that was coming in spring, so that timing would work out really well with those bright, cheery colors. but we then were thinking about a topic or a theme that would work. Like we wouldn't have done Secret Agent with the transparency watercolors
Right.
fabrics, you know. So we were trying to think of something that would be fun and lighthearted and sweet, you know, just a cheerful palette. So.
And so, because we are fabric designers, we're often working with our fabrics as we design, not always, but very often. And so another quilt, if you could hand me this one, is called Billiards. And can you hand me the Modern Quilts Illustrated 13,
Yeah.
please? Before I hold it
This
up.
is the finished quilt.
And I'm holding it next to it just so you can get a sense of the scale. These curves are enormous.
Yeah.
And I've mentioned the backstory of this a little bit before, but if I could have the cover, please.
Yeah.
If you look at it, you see that it's very much about shapes. We've got the giant triangles, we've got the concentric circles, but it's also within the form of the whole napping quilt. And this was a quilt that didn't have a name right away. It was a sketch I had done 8 years previously, and the scale was originally tiny. These were going to be tiny blocks. It was a multicolored quilt. It was very, very busy. It had so much going on.
It was not this design. It was a variation.
It was
of
a
this,
variation
a more
of it.
complex variation.
A more complex variation, but we knew that it needed editing, and I kept pushing it and it wouldn't work. And we happened to have just designed a new line of fabric. And in the end, it went from being a multicolored small scale quilt to a large scale quilt with just 5 fabrics. And it was weeks of encouragement of, I was kind of editing and removing elements of the original design, which was overcomplicated. And it all came together. And I think one of the reasons it was unified is it became simpler. And the name Billiards came out of the geometry, because if you have played pool, you've got the triangle for queuing up the balls. You've got the perfect circle of the balls. You've got the rectangle of the pool table. Now, I don't expect anyone to look at this and say, oh, it makes me think of playing pool. You know, there's not an 8 ball.
Right.
It's not literal that way, but that game is so much about geometry and angles and positions. And we realized that there was kind of a unity and almost a simplicity yet complexity that suited, the name suited the form, at least to me.
Exactly. So that you know, this was what, 7, 8 years it took us to like get the kinks out of that design.
From
sometimes
the initial
it's
sketch.
fast, and sometimes it just
Like
it
Tube
has
Socks,
to simmer.
Tube Socks was super fast.
Yeah.
I think you had this idea.
Yeah,
didn't you?
because
And
I
this
was thinking about how to use those yarn dyes in mix up a whole bunch of yarn dyes. And yes, Elizabeth says the emblems make her think of the radiation symbol. Yeah, we noticed that, we had not thought about that, but we noticed when it was in Japan that they blended it with another, because Japan obviously having been the recipient of radioactive bombs, has a very strong reaction to that symbol. They blended it with another quilt
in a photo collage they did.
Yeah, to minimize that radiation kind of feeling.
Yeah, that was not intentional.
That was not intentional. But anyway, back to Tube Socks. We were thinking about how are we going to combine all of these plaids. And the Tube Socks makes her think of the DNA chromosomes. You never know what reference point people have. But our daughter, I think our daughter's like senior year in high school or something, and she played soccer year round, and so we had
on so many different teams with different colored socks.
Yeah, and so we had so many Tube Socks lying around, but I thought that there would be kind of a vintage appeal for people who
nostalgia.
grew up or had kids in the 80s.
And also, it allowed, I don't know how many of the stripes you can see, it's something that we like, which is improvisation within structure, kind of all the stripes are, there's math for them in the pattern, but you can really make things up and make lots and lots.
And the pattern is in warp and
Yeah,
weft.
if I can grab that. You can make lots of combinations and lay them out as you go along, or after you've sewn them all. I just want to find,
There we go.
here is the tube
At our
sock.
local soccer field,
Yeah.
where our daughter used to play soccer.
And yeah, we actually shot it on the soccer field. It's a very stash-friendly
Very
pattern.
stash friendly.
But also, the interesting thing is the term tube, you think round, but really a tube sock is just a rectangle. And it worked really, really well with the reality of quilting, which is strips, straight lines. And once I think you also abstract something like a tube sock, the name helps you see it and imagine it differently. So sometimes a name can be very evocative, and I hope that is for people.
Yeah. Okay, there were requests to have one last look before we sign off at Lucky.
Oh, Lucky, who's now...
she's having her afternoon nap right now.
But we'll break that nap. Just have
Lucky?
Lucky say good night, good afternoon.
Yes, come on.
And I think Lucky is going to be making some future appearances.
Yes, she's fully grown. We assume when she was surrendered, her previous owner said she was a Bichon frisée, so we will figure out. We may get that genetic testing to see whether that's the case or whether
But the guess is that she's about a year
mix
old
or something. Yeah, she's
doesn't really matter what she is.
13
She's a
months
lovely
old.
dog.
But she's got a really nice temperament, and we hope maybe could become a therapy dog
We'll see.
for our local school.
At
We'll
the
see.
very least, therapy for us.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
yeah, you're going to help us.
So,
Thank you all
we
for
will-
joining us.
yes, we will see you next month.
Yeah.
And
I don't know if Lucky will make an appearance next month, but we'll see.
yes. So let us know if you haven't taken the poll. Let us know what your thoughts are about future quiltalongs, and
Right.
we will take that into consideration.
But
we will
things
have
are coming up for the summer, and we'll keep you posted.
and we will have we will be telling you very soon what our next online event is.
Yeah.
So stick around, and then at the end of the month, we're going to have an unboxing of a new fabric line.
Oh, wow, that's just
That,
around the
yeah, I
corner.
should mention this quickly. We're not stopping designing fabric, but we're taking a break for one season. So that will be our last fabric line for a year. So
We have others that are already in production
Right.
a year from now, but we're giving ourselves a little break.
Right. So so if we have events, that's also good for the kind of stash friendly
Exactly.
events. So
take care.
solid friendly events. Okay, so Lucky says goodbye and have a great week.